All right, everyone. Thank you for coming to workshop number 4. This workshop will be one that focuses slightly more on BP, but is also generally applicable to world schools because whipping is something that is incredibly important within both formats. Our speaker for today is Rahul.
Accessibility shortcuts.
Oh, accessibility is great. Our speaker for today is Rahul. So Rahul is also exceptionally talented speaker, done incredibly well in a bunch of tournaments, especially within the BP and the APDA, which is American Parliamentary Debate circuit. So Rahul was a grand finalist at Nordic, which is the North American BP Debating Championships, a grand finalist at Uhuru Worlds, which was very recently, quarterfinalist is McGill IV, which is one of the most competitive Canadian tournaments. A grand finalist at Edinburgh Australs, and also the current APTA national champion. So within another format within American debate, he's champion in that. So absolutely like stacked CV. He's done maybe like 40 competitions over the past 2 years. So incredibly talented speaker, and I think there's a lot to get out of this workshop. So as usual, if anyone is comfortable turning videos on, we'd really appreciate that. Just because again, the point of this workshop is that we gain speakers who are of international level talent. And even though you might be able to get those lectures online already by other people, these speakers are here and you can ask them questions and it's a lot more interactive. So the more you interact, the more we hope you can stand to get out of it. But yeah, again, thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Rahul. And if anyone has like friends, uni members, teammates, school debate people, let them know. And yeah, let's have a great session.
All right. Thanks, John. Pleasure to be here. Nice to meet you all. Let me see if I can share my slides, then we can just get started. John, was it showing correctly?
Yeah, looks good.
All right, sweet. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Rahul. I've been debating for about 3 years now in the American circuit. I speak whip in BP, and I have spoken whip in 3v3 formats, not as much, but I have some experience with it. So yeah, a quick note on like how this is going to go. I think whip is a really important position because it's really flexible. There's a lot of content to go through, and a good whip can make a debate, a bad whip can break a debate. So it's really easy to feel frustrated, especially when you start learning to speak whip or summary position or whatever you want to call it, because it's often hard to know exactly what to do. This is especially true in BP, but it's also true in 3v3. It's just that there's a lot of things you could use your time for, and you never know what exactly is going to win you the debate. So that's why it takes a lot of experience, but also there are certain things you can do when you approach whip that make it easier to do. I'll talk a bit about those. So at first, let's talk about what this talk is going to be about. I think a lot of this talk can easily be applied to whipping in general, both in 3v3 or in World Schools format or whatever, and also in BP. So because I have more experience in BP, how I think I'm going to do this is first I'm going to talk about general strategy in whip, what you should do as a summary speaker, how to approach clashes. All those things will be very applicable across formats. And then I'm going to talk about BP specific strategy, and that's going to be a little more technical just because like there's a lot more moving parts in BP that you have to do because there are just yeah, because there are just 4 teams and it's just a lot of work. But a lot of that knowledge will also just be applicable to 3v3, and I'll try to like explain that when it comes through. So yeah, let's just go ahead and get started, I think. So general whip strategy. I think the main thing to note here is what exactly you're supposed to be doing as a whip. And then beyond that, it's more about like, refutation, clashes, how to order your speech, how to organize, how to move through it. It's just going to be some general tips and tricks within there. So what is the job of a whip speaker? The way I think you should think about speaking whip in whatever format you're speaking it, is you're resolving clashing material within the debate. By the time you were speaking, there's already been like sometimes 4 speeches in BP, there's been like 6 or 7 speeches that have come out, and people have just been saying a ton of things. Many of them are quite smart, some of them are quite stupid, and it's your job to explain to the judge which is which and why they should care about them. So the way to think about this is you're not just giving a speech, you're trying to explain to the judge how they should view the debate as it's come so far. And this is a bit different than like reply speeches, which are a lot more like weighing based and a lot more like giving like a reason why your team should win. But SWIP specifically, their main job is to talk to the judge and walk them through the debate and explain to them why they should see the debate in the way that is good for their team, right? So generally people think of whipping as like a mix of rebuilding arguments, adding responses to the opposite team. It's important to know how both of those aspects are going to work together when you're trying to give a whip speech. And the biggest skill that I think any whip really needs to know is the ability to analyze the debate. What do I mean by that? I mean pointing out reasoning or analysis from either team. Let's say a team gives like 3 or 4 reasons why you should believe a certain thing that they're arguing in the debate. What the whip needs to be able to do is point out those reasons and analyze those reasons. Explain how the material from each team clashes. Some questions that I think are really useful to ask yourself or to answer within whip. The first one, what does this argument rely upon? And what I mean by that is if government team is trying to explain to me that this thing will like, I don't know, cause inflation or this thing will hurt people on the ground, I need to understand what things has government team needed to prove for me to believe that it will hurt people on the ground. What are the premises of their argument, if you will? And the reason this question matters is because when I ask myself that question, I know what to refute the most. I know what is most important for me as a whip speaker in opposition, for example, to refute from government team. Or the same thing is true from my own side. If there's one thing that I really need to prove for the rest of my impacts in the debate to come through, if there's one premise that's super, super important for my team to access the argument they want to run, then it's really important that I spend most of my whip time as a whip speaker explaining why we win that premise and explaining why that premise matters. So a lot of this is very much following the logical chain of your debate and trying to explain it to a judge. The second question I think you should ask yourself, what does this argument actually prove? And this is very useful when you're doing refutation, especially because a lot of teams will say a lot of things and some of them will make sense. The important thing to note is even if a team makes an argument or gives a statement, being realistic with yourself and knowing what is actually being proven, how much of it you can believe is really quite important. And the key thing here is your own intuition. Debate is an act of just logic, right? Like you are a human being who has rational skills. So just look at the debate and like step away from like the technicality of, oh, they said 4 things, we said 5 things. And for a second, just think about what they've actually told you and whether you really believe it. Because your intuition, especially in the whip speech, when there's not much time and you have to convince a judge, is the biggest tool that you have. Because if you can couch your rebuttal in the most intuitive way, if you can just say, like, judge, think about this for a second. This does not hold water. It's not really reasonable. Those are the most useful basic skills you need as a whip to convince your judge that something's not right or that the other team has not proven what they think they've proven. And the last question is one that you're going to really want to ask yourself. How dangerous is this content to my team's case? And what I mean by that is, let's say government team makes an argument and they prove it fully, they prove it quite well, they're all really good, right? If that's the case, as a whip for the opposition, what I'm asking myself every second of the whip is how dangerous is it if they win this specific thing? How dangerous is it if this specific clash is good for them? And like thinking about how it interacts with your own case, how it might hurt your own arguments is very important. So if they prove a premise that is going to like take away your whole case, that is like contrary to what you've told the judge, that's something that's very dangerous. You need to spend a lot of time on it. But if they prove a different benefit to a smaller group of people, for example, they prove that a certain like social class is going to be hurt by this policy. Well, if you have arguments about a different social class that are hurt in a far greater way, then that's one of those things you can say, okay, sure, they proved this. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Our thing is just going to be more important. And that's how you can choose how to set your time as a whip. So that's really the most important thing about whip. It's choosing what to respond to and when to respond to it. I will say in 3v3, whips are generally a little simpler. Not easier, but they are simpler than they are in BP because you have enough time to usually get through all the content. So your job in 3v3 is quite simple. You're just being destructive. Save the bulk of your time for the densest parts of their cases and the most important things that they say. But really your job is just, okay, here's something that we're talking about. Here's a clash. They have said these 3 things. Here's why you don't believe these 3 things. Either because my first 2 speakers already told you why you don't believe them, or I'm going to respond to them and tell you why you don't believe them. Your job is to just obliterate their case as much as possible and leave your case standing. That is the whip's job, plain and simple. In a two-team format, whipping is often easy to conceptualize as linear or ordered. So you're just walking the judge through each clash, each chronological step in the debate, and you're resolving it for them. The most important thing that you can train is clarity, engaging with the debate in an easily understandable way that maximizes your chances, because you don't want the judge confused because you've dropped 5 or 6 reasons that something doesn't work, or you've explained like 4 or 5 levels of like weighing. Like, yes, you should be doing those things, but even more important than doing those things is making sure the judge can understand you when you do those things. So those are specifically what you want to train as a whip. Great. So I'm going to start talking about refutation strategies here because I think it's really important specifically for whip because a lot of your work will be in responsiveness. This is a concept that may be more unfamiliar to novices. If you're more advanced, you might like already know these things and have already understood them. I'm going to take some time and walk through them. So different institutions, different speakers, different people you ask, they will conceptualize this differently. But there are generally 4 types of rebuttal, if you want to think of them that way, right? The 4 ways to respond. The 4 ways that I think of are mitigation, refutation, turning an argument, and weighing the argument. I'm going to go through them in order, and then I'm going to talk about how the whip specifically wants to use these things. So the first thing is mitigation. What this really means is you're lessening the impact of an argument or you're limiting the scope of the argument. For example, if they say, for example, if they're talking about like a policy change that the government is proposing and how it's going to affect people, as op, when some mitigation I could run is to say, actually, not many people are affected by this specific policy change, or people have multiple ways to access a benefit, like, I don't know, like some kind of financial stability or some kind of payment. And so even if they lose this specific way, it's not really a huge harm to them because they'll still have money from some other source. So like, do you see that? Like what's happening there is you're not disproving the argument. You're simply saying that it doesn't prove as much as they claim it proves. So mitigation is really just like limiting the impact, kind of like stretching the margin of the debate so the other team can't claim a huge change that they create. This is important, but it's also the weakest form of rebuttal because the opponent still retains some impact or ground. And a lot of whips or a lot of people will just say, oh, this is just mitigation. It doesn't really matter. And most of the time, they're kind of correct. This doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Often it's necessary against really strong arguments. But there's an extra step a lot of people miss when they mitigate an argument. And that is, if you're going to mitigate, the extra step you must take is explain to the judge what your mitigation does for the debate. For example, now that this been, like, for example, let's say I have mitigated their case. Now I can say, now that I've given you that analysis, our arguments are far more meaningful or affect more people because they have lesser impact. So the main step that people forget when they mitigate is to explain why that mitigation matters, to show the judge, here's the weakened case they now have, and here's why, in absence of their stronger case, our case is actually far better. So that's just like the rule with mitigation is just you have to explain why it's the case that matters within the round or why it's useful to you as a whip speaker. The second form of rebuttal is refutation, which is like exactly what it sounds like and what people generally think of. It's just countering an argument or explaining what it does, like why it doesn't work. There are a few things that I think are really important to think about here. You have an argument that government is given, for example. There are some premises or some like ideas within that argument which are backed up, hopefully, like by some reasons that they've given you as to why you should believe those things. So they'll say, our first argument is this. Here's A, B, and C reason why you should believe that argument. How do you go about refuting that? Most people will simply rattle off counter reasons or reasons why a premise is not true. So they'll just say, oh, they told you that this is true. Like, for example, that you cause inflation in like some policy causes inflation. And so people will like be hurt by inflation, like the cost of things will rise and things will be difficult for them. And then people in whip will just say, here's 3 reasons why you don't cause inflation. Sure, this is refutation and it's important, but it's a problem because generally it leaves the judge with 2 competing sets of reasons. I have Gov's reasons for why inflation happens. I have Op's reasons for why inflation doesn't happen. And this oftentimes is not really ideal for you because you don't want the judge to buy the other team's reasons. So this necessitates a little more work to be valid. If you're going to refute, you also have to engage with their reasons and explain why the judge should prefer your analysis to theirs. So that's the nuance that most people lack when they try to refute in the first place. You want to focus your reputation, not just on giving other reasons as to why they're not correct, but also interacting with how they prove their argument by saying, this is their first reason. Think about it for a second. I don't think it's really fair because this is true or that's true. Or saying their reasons all deal with like, I don't know, how individual people react. Our reasons are better because we talk about how the government wants them to react and how the government wants to act. And so our reasons kick in before their reasons would kick in the first place. These are all just general examples, but your job is essentially to dissect the reasons they give to support their arguments and challenge their logic. The end goal of refutation generally is killing the argument or disproving it so the opposing team cannot use it to win. This is often enough, especially when you have your own clashing arguments that can now be weighed and credited. So refutation and doing it clinically and well is quite important as a whip speaker. It's oftentimes like what is the best thing about whip or the best thing you can do in whip. The third form of rebuttal is called turning or flipping arguments. That's exactly what it sounds like. You take an argument or like a reason from the other side and you flip it to show why it actually benefits your side. There's generally two ways this happens. The first one is turning impacts. So you take an impact or an endpoint, something the opposition side has claimed. Like, for example, this is going to hurt poor people because it means that they often fall to unemployment far more. And then you can just say, turning this and explaining why it actually happens far more on your side, or why it's the case you get to that endpoint better. So a turn on this would be, op tells you that this causes unemployment that's generally bad. Here's why their side actually has far worse unemployment. Here's why we solve that problem. And this turns their argument because now the very harm they were pointing out is now laid on their side of the house and they have to deal with it in addition to everything else you've already said. Sometimes this can fall into a trap of like kind of just counter asserting things where you just say something and they say the opposite. The key difference you have to make here is breaking that balance by explaining why your mechanisms get to the impact better than theirs will. So it takes a lot of work on it and analyzing what everyone has said in the debate, but it's a very useful strategy because it gives you the most ground, or it makes the most damage to the opposition case that they have to deal with. It's hard to formalize what flipping actually looks like. It's very situational. Like depending on what they say, what a flip looks like is very different, or like how you're going to get about it goes very different. It's a situational tool. Not every argument can be flipped, and oftentimes it'll take more work and effort than it's worth and may not work all the time. But it's especially useful in whip because you are limited by how much constructive work you can do. You cannot get up and whip and say, here's our fourth argument, let's talk about it. But what you can do is you can say, here's their argument, we're going to flip it and prove why it's actually a benefit for our side. And that's a very useful thing, especially in BP, when it sometimes is hard to prove that you have an extension, or it's hard to prove you have some ground in the debate. Being able to flip arguments is quite useful in those specific cases. Great. The last kind of rebuttal. And this is the one that like is the most like broad category. A lot of people like don't know how to consider it or think of it as different than responses. But it's basically just weighing. And what that means is explaining to a judge why something is more meaningful than something else, or why, if both things are true, for example, you should care more about one impact than another. There are a ton of different metrics. We might talk about them later, and like that's like a whole lecture in and of itself on weighing. I think it's one of the most difficult skills for debaters to pick up because it's very unintuitive, or it's very difficult to conceptualize because we all just weigh things internally all the time. We all have our own value systems, and formalizing that to a judge and explaining to them why they should pick your value system can sometimes be quite difficult. But specifically in terms of refutation, what I mean is, in the event that the op team has a strong argument standing, the best course of action is often to weigh against the argument, which means explain why the judge should care less about it, prefer your arguments. This is useful for taking opposition arguments at their best and successfully beating them, even when the judge doesn't buy other aspects of your responses. The one other thing I want to talk about is a form of weighing that some people will call meta weighing or meta observations. That's just a bunch of buzzwords. What it really is just looking at the case through the eyes of a judge and explaining how the judge should evaluate the argument. For example, let's say that op has a claim that's very strong, but they have to prove 4 or 5 different steps to get to it. As a whip, I might, even before I engage with the argument, just say, guys, even if they're correct, let's look at their argument. First, you have to believe this, then you have to believe this, then you have to believe this, then you have to believe this. This is a very long, very convoluted argument. And so if you have any doubt about any of those links, any doubt about any of the logical chain here, their argument is quite weak because it relies upon proving a ton of burdens very conclusively. So just in general, the likelihood of this argument being a good one, and the likelihood of this impact actually happening is quite low just because they had to jump through so many hoops to get there. This is very different than the normal form of responses because it goes outside what is actually true in the debate and tells the judge how to think about it from the lens of debate itself. The other way this normally happens is things like, oh, this team misses a certain burden or thing they needed to prove, and so I can't really believe this argument. Like, for example, going back to the inflation example, which I'll be using a lot. Let's say that the op team says, oh, when inflation happens, people are out of a job and it's terrible. Or when inflation happens, people like can't afford food and therefore they turn to crime or something like that, whatever their impact is, right? the obvious thing you have to prove to explain that people are unemployed is to first explain that inflation will happen, right? So let's say an op team is like not super good at their job, and they just give you all the impact and say inflation is bad because it causes ABC. What I would obviously do as a whip is I would just say, hold on, hold on, hold on. Maybe they're right that inflation causes these things, but I don't think they've proven inflation actually happens. So you can't really believe that these other things happen because here's 4 reasons why inflation won't happen. And that's a way to like weigh and observe the debate in a way that's good for your team. There is a hierarchy to these forms of responses that you should care about in whip. The way that I think about it is if you can, you first choose to turn or flip the argument. If you can't flip it, then you put some weighing against it. If you can't, or like, and then after you've done those things, that's when you start refuting. And after you've done refutation, that's when you do mitigation. There is a hierarchy to how it works based upon how effective it is for your side. The reason weighing is so high on the list, even though it doesn't seem to actually interact with the argument, is because it's the most efficient way to give a response. Because sure, you can spend 4 minutes of your whip responding to an argument, and maybe you'll kill it by the end. But a lot of time, there's more content in the round than you can actually deal with. Weighing is useful because it doesn't rely upon you spending a lot of time beating the argument. It just says, here is the argument or here's the content as it stands. Here's why we don't care about it too much. And that's far more useful as a use of your time than refuting every small thing. So it's really important as a whip, and this comes with experience, to know how to balance things and how to choose what to do at what time specifically. An important note on giving responses as a whip: implicate or explain what your response does for the round as a whole. Because this is the one thing that tons of people don't do, and it makes the refutation so much weaker. You have given 3 killer responses to an argument. What does the judge do with that? You have to also take the time to tell the judge, look, we have mitigated their case, so they access like half their impact. Or you have to tell them, I have disproved their premise, and so you can't credit that argument as a whole. It sounds simple, but it's actually quite important because you want to tell your judge why this refutation does what you think it does and how they should view the round with that in mind. So if it flips an argument and widens the margin, I would just say, look, they told you that this is going, like, inflation is going to rise on our side of the house. What I've done in this last 30 seconds is tell you why inflation actually spikes much more on their side. So if you believe any of their arguments about bad things happening when inflation occurs, well, guess what? It happens more on their side of the house, and we flip that argument. So take all the harms and put it on their side. Something like that. A lot of people have different styles of doing this. It's very dependent upon how rhetorical or how technical you are as a whip, but it is very important to explain your rebuttal and why it matters in the round. Okay, last general thing I want to talk about before we get into some BP specific stuff is clashes and how to structure them. What do I mean by this? So like clash is really any kind of thing that teams could disagree upon within the round. Oftentimes, this is things like impacts within the round or how a certain group of people will react, characterization, things like whether this is good or bad for the economy. You can label them however you like, and we're going to talk a little bit more. The first thing I want to talk about is setting up clashes in prep time, because this is really where most of your time as a third speaker should actually go, right? Because your other 2 speakers, they're quite smart. They're out there writing the stuff and like all the argumentation. As a third speaker, there's not really much use to being there and helping them unless you're just helping them write arguments, because you don't know what's going to happen by the time your speech goes. You have to be adaptive and react. The easiest way to do that is to take the load off yourself, and in prep, think to yourself, what will the clashes within this debate be? What is the natural case for op to run? What's the natural case for us to run? And where do those things clash? For example, yeah, sorry about that. Not sure where my video was. Okay, I'm back. 1 second. Yep. So what I mean by that is, specifically as a whip, you segment your thoughts into what clashes will occur and how you can choose between them or engage between them. This is an experience game that you will just learn more as you do more whip, but the general idea you want, just have some weighing on hand, observations on hand, ways to think about the round on hand to make your job easier. If you know that your team is going to try to win off a certain argument, and you know there's 2 or 3 other clashes in the debate that op is going to try to win off of, then your job as a whip is to say, assuming we prove this, and assuming that they talk about these other things, and assuming everyone does a good job of doing it, How can I convince the judge to still vote for us? And those are questions you can absolutely answer in prep and just write on a sheet of paper. Here's how I'm planning to weigh against this. Here's how I'm planning to interact with that. These are things that will make your life a lot easier as a whip. And I know that like it sounds kind of non-concrete, but as you just speak more whip and as you think about it, it'll become far easier for you. Great. Flowing clashes during the debate, because I think the biggest like limiting factor, the biggest point at which people struggle with whip is just when people are in the round saying many, many words and you just don't know how to respond to all the words they are saying. Very fair. I think the way that you can move through this is different depending on the person, but I'll just tell you what I do. I have different pages for each clash with our argument skeleton for that clash. So if my team says, hey, on the facet of the economy, we're going to argue two very specific things, that this like increases investment, for example, and that this makes it easier for people to hold jobs within the country because it makes employers like more likely to employ you. Okay, sure. So what I will do is at the top in big words, I'll be like economic impacts or whatever, like the economy, like whatever you want to call it. And then I'll just say, here are the impacts we have, and here's a general sketch of how we're getting there. And then I'll just listen to the round. Every time the opposing team says something about the economy that I think is related to this clash, I will just write on this sheet, they say this, or this is the push that they have, and I'll note why they think so. And then I'll leave myself some room. And while I'm writing my whip, I'll just say, how do I want to respond to this? How do I want to weigh it against this? When my team says something, I write it down in a different color and I'll say, this is what they're saying. So at the end of the previous speeches, I have a page that is dedicated to this clash that has the information that they have and the information that we have. So then in whip, I can just move through these clashes and I can say three things in the speech. First, the economy. Second, this other thing. Third, some way. And I'll be like, okay, on the economy, they've said this and this. These are their arguments. Here are our arguments. And then you can just move through them and try to figure out how you're going to interact with the debate in that way. Yeah, and just the last thing I would say is important is after you finish with a clash or talk through it, make sure that you explain why it resolves for your team and make sure what you explain why you're winning that clash. And those are things we'll talk about a little later. But it just generally boils down to here are the things that they've told you. Here's why they're generally not sure. Here are the responses to them. And then that leaves room for you to explain why you're winning that clash. Knowing which clash to win, which is really the most difficult point, right? Because it's like you can talk about anything. The question is, do you talk about the right thing? And the way that you do that is I think the best way to think about this is what is your path to victory or your win condition? A lot of people like throw these words around. Don't overthink them. It's really the most simplest thing. It's really just what do I need to prove for the judge to just vote for me? Like, if I just prove this thing and I prove it well, then there's no way the judge doesn't pick me, is really what you're trying to talk about, right? So a few metrics to think about. First, where do you have the biggest impact? Like quite rationally, where are you doing the most damage? Where's the most important? Secondly, where has your team spent the most time and where is most underdeveloped? Because if your team is only given like a little bit of content on this certain idea, it's probably not easy to win upon just because the other team can easily take it out once you've talked about it in reply or something like that. But third, where has your opponent covered a lot and where are they avoided engaging? And this is really important because sometimes the most strategic thing to do is to just win where your opponent is losing. So if your opponent takes your main argument and beats it really, really well, then in whip, maybe I'll say, look, our main argument still exists. It's pretty good. But also, here's that other thing my second speaker said that they didn't really respond to at all. Here's why it's the most important thing. Here's why you care about it. And that's a much clearer way to win the debate than messing with the weeds of whatever they're responding to a lot. So those are things you can think about. Some tips and tricks. I think explicitly working through competing analysis is quite important. What I mean by that is just literally saying, they say this, we say that. People have different takes on like this kind of like line by line structure. I think in 3v3, it's quite reasonable as long as you're not just too in the weeds and you can still have some round vision around awareness. But this is really up to you and like your like what you like doing as a whip. I think that it's not the best and not the worst strategy. It's just sometimes useful, especially when you're new and like don't know how to pick what to respond to. The second thing is that a lot of whip is about perceptually winning. And what I mean by that is even if on paper, your mechanisms aren't that strong, the judge is not a machine. The judge does not really know that. The judge is just going off of whatever vibe you give off. So especially at the points when you think, oh, we're losing this clash, we're done for, that's when you want to sound the most confident. And I know that looks different for different people. And I don't think that it's like very important to talk about what like might look better and might look worse. But it's really just in your mind thinking, I need to sound like I know I'm winning this. And if I sound like that, then 90% of judges will just assume I'm winning it, even if I'm not. And those are things that like sure, aren't the most formal or technical debate settings, but in whip especially, it's very important that you plan out when you're going to sound like you're winning the debate, when you think you know what you're doing. And those are things that judges believe quite a lot. Okay, great. That's all general whip advice. I think now I'm going to talk specifically about BP strategy because BP is quite different as a.
He doesn't sound Sri Lankan. What is the BP?
Okay, I will explain what BP is. You are unmuted. Sorry about that. So BP is British parliamentary. It's an international format. If you debate in college, you would likely do a lot of it. I think there are also some high schools doing it. The one big difference between BP and 3v3 or World Schools is there's 4 teams in a round in BP. So there's a little extra complexity to whip. It's the same job, really. It's except now instead of responding to one other team, you're responding to 3 other teams, including one team that's on the same side as you. So if you are closing government, there is an opening government team that is arguing the same motion as you that has had different arguments. And so your job as closing government is to provide a different argument and still win the round for your team. So you're, as a whip, you're also basically like trying to take out your top half or trying to explain why you are better than the other government team that exists. Yeah, so let's just talk about this generally. What is the role of a whip in BP and what does it change? Yeah, the main difference is obviously that there's now 4 teams. And this means that there are dynamics about opening and closing. So your opening will take all the normal, like stock, reasonable arguments. And as closing, oftentimes you must be more creative. You must find ways to give new arguments or create new reasons that aren't generally what you think of at first, which is why, once again, closing strategy is a whole different lecture topic that you can talk about. In terms of what you should do when you're burnt, or like, and by burnt, I mean when the opening team says all the things that you were thinking and you have nothing to say, like how you still win the round from those positions. But the real difference is just that there's way more content that you have to sort through in BP. It's just a lot of people saying a lot more things than you're normally like supposed to in like 3v3. And so there's no way ever that you respond to everything within 7 minutes. What you have to do is prioritize. And that's where I think it's easy to reduce the whip into 2 jobs. The first one is positioning and whipping the extension. Basically, the speaker before you, the member of government or member of opposition, has given something called an extension. We'll talk about what an extension is in a quick second, but they've given an argument or a couple arguments, usually no more than 2 or 3. Your job as a whip is to explain why those arguments specifically won the round. And then the second job as a whip is rebutting and engaging the other teams and the other houses in the debate, explaining why they are incorrect or why you shouldn't, like why you should take it over them. And we'll talk about those dynamics more clearly in a second. Great, hang on. All right. So a brief note on like extension, because yeah, like what is extending? What does that mean? I don't know. So an extension is basically at its basic point, a new argument. Your opening government in 2 speeches has given some arguments about the debate. Your job in extension is to give a different argument or a different way of looking at the round, a different contribution, and explain why that contribution is more important. There's generally 2 ways that this happens: vertical and horizontal extensions. Vertical extensions are, they have given an argument, we are going to engage in the same argument, but prove it in a better way, or explain why their argument wasn't sufficient. A horizontal extension is, they have provided a certain impact, you're going to provide a totally different impact and explain why that impact is more important. Let's do this by example. Let's think of the motion. There's one that I did recently. This house supports tough on crime policies in areas with gang violence, let's say. Tough on crime policies are basically just, oh, like you're really harsh with punishment. Oh, you have proactive policing and you like, like are much more like aggressive about catching gang members. You punish them much more harshly. You like, I don't know, you criminalize like much more often. You make more arrests, things like that. Just the police force is just much more aggressive towards gangs and in effect to curb gang violence. Let's take opposition on this debate. Opening opposition, the first opposition team, let's say their argument is, when these policies are applied badly, it angers people and worsens their cooperation, which helps gangs. That's a reasonable argument, right? It's that when you do tough on crime policing and the police abuse their power, people get angry with you, and so they actually help gangs more often or don't turn them into you, things like that. 2 ways I could extend on this from closing. The first one is a vertical extension. Let's say they don't correctly analyze why the government might apply these policies badly. Like they don't explain to you why it's the case that when you do tough on crime, a lot of police forces are corrupt. A lot of people don't really think about this. Like populist politicians oftentimes want you to just arrest a ton of people for like signaling power, whatever you call it. The first way to extend is the vertical, in which I, as member of opposition, would say, hey, they told you this argument, and it's a good argument, but they never explained to you why the governments will do this badly, and so they have missed the burden for their argument. My vertical extension is proving that instead, which is then, can you do me a favor and don't write on the slides, please? Thank you. BP is, once again, it's an international format. There's just 4 teams in the room. It's still like it's quite similar like to 3v3 in terms of how debates actually happen. It's just there's a different dynamic. Okay, great. So a vertical is basically when you have the same argument, but you make it in a better way. And the important thing to note there is you have to differentiate that argument from your opening, explain why it's new, explain why it's important. The second form of extending is horizontal extensions. For example, in the same example of tough on crime, I could simply say, oh, we're going to make a different argument that these policies, regardless of how they're enforced, they inflame gang violence, they make gangs retaliate in worse ways, they worsen this violence. That's a totally separate argument. And so I, as closing, can simply say, we have made a different argument, it's probably a better argument, that's important. This is probably the better way to extend. Like if you have a horizontal extension, a good argument you can make they haven't already made, you should want to take that argument. But oftentimes there's not that much to do, and that's when verticals are very important. So hopefully that gives you a little understanding of these things. I'm just going to start talking about BP in general now. Great. So what does whipping the extension actually look like? Yes, BP is British parliamentary. Yeah. Give me 1 second. Yeah, John, can you check yourself real quick? All right.
Sorry, what
All right.
happened? What happened?
Nothing. You're all good. I just had a slight technical issue. Okay.
Oh,
So
is this the questions
anyway,
about whether this is a BP specific workshop?
yeah. So
Oh, all right. Could we sorry, Rahul. Could we just get a head count within the room of the number of people here to focus on BP and the number of people focusing on 3v3s? So if you could just get like a thumbs up in the chat, because this workshop is intended to be a workshop on British parliamentary. So I think Rahul explained this before, but British parliamentary is essentially the big format in current university debate. So whereas Asian parliamentary or world schools format will be 2 teams with 3 speakers, British parliamentary will be 4 teams within a round, each having 2 speakers. So that's modeled after like British Parliament, kind of. And while whips will perform generally very similar functions in both formats, the difference is in BP, the whip speaker is trying to weigh your team against 3 other teams as opposed to 1. So it's not like a linear comparison of like, say, A versus B, it's a comparison of like A, B, C, D. And so you might be in positions where you want to say like, oh, we might not be A, but we're still at least B, because your position in BP rounds matters. So yeah, I'd assume that most people within this room are here for the BP component, but could we just get like if you could like type in chat whether you want to just focus a bit more on 3v3, in which case maybe Rahul could just focus on like general thoughts that might go beyond the slides, just talk about whipping, or whether you want to go into BP as well, because I'm pretty sure that there's some people from universities here as well. So if you could let us know in chat or just put a thumbs up now if you want more BP content, that would be really helpful.
yeah, John, I will also say, like, I can talk about either, but like, you probably will find my experience in BP more useful than Australs or 3v3.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think since this workshop was explicitly marketed as a BP specific
We
workshop,
also,
I'm
yeah.
gonna like change it around. But I would note for everyone who wants 3v3 experience, I think two observations here. One is that the meta in 3v3 debate is heavily influenced by BP. And the reason for that is so this is how it works. There's a little bit of a flow. So Sri Lankan judging standards tend to be influenced by what the World Schools team is doing because that just tends to be within the schools format, like those teams tend to win a bit more. The World Schools team strategy tends to be influenced by what World School judges are doing. And World School judges tend to be university debaters who are being influenced by norms within WDC. So if you look at like in 2020, like things like framing and weighing becoming more dominant within like the local circuit, is a direct flow of things like framing becoming meta in WUDC around like 2018, 2019. So that being said, as a whip, watching this workshop will be useful. But yeah, big spiel, but let's get back to the program. Rahul can maybe,
Okay.
yeah, I think I explained BP, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to just pop it on chat and we'll do our best to respond. But yeah, back to
Yeah.
Rahul.
All right, sweet. So we're just gonna keep going with this. I think this is going to this is just going to be the more useful part of the lecture. What is your job as a whip in BP? You are whipping the extension. What do I mean by that? Four general ideas. The first one, you are positioning or introducing the extension, basically finding the entry point into the debate. A lot of whips will just say this explicitly. How do we enter this round? Why is our team the most important? Here's why. So introductions are really, really important in whip because you can say things like, and this is what people will often say, oh, top half, the opening halves, they missed this part of the debate. Or every other house in the debate talks about something, but they don't talk about this one specific really important thing. That is the thesis of a good closing team in BP. You have one or two really important things that are going to outweigh the entire round, are going to be the most important. And you as a whip, your sole job is explaining to the judge why they should care about your thing the most. So that's what introducing the extension looks like. Basically telling the judge, here is where our team lies in the debate. Like, I think the best way to think about this, right? BP is kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. Your member has said something, but nobody knows where it fits into the round or how it actually works. Your job is to explain to the judge where it fits in and why it fits in and why it's so important. So I think the important thing to note on positioning or introducing the extension, figure out how much work you have to do. Was your member able to fully prove the argument? Are you really happy with where you're standing in the round right now? Or did they maybe miss something, which is understandable. It happens because member is very, very high pressure. Is there some work you need to do to rebuild the extension? Did closing opposition do a lot of really good damage to your extension? Or are you now struggling as a whip to figure that out? Those are all questions you need to ask yourself and adapt within whip to fix those problems. The most important part of whipping the extension, I think, is crystallization. What I mean by that is making it clear to the judge what your extension is and what is within the extension. Because a lot of judges, after a closing team that's like very unclear, will just say, I don't really know what their extension is. I don't really know why it matters. There's three things I want to talk about in crystallization. The first one, know what your crucial mechanisms are. And what I mean by that is there's usually one or two very important pieces of content or reasons that carry your case, that are proving your thing. I often, when I extend, because I speak both formats, both positions, when I extend, what I'll often do is, here's the extension, three crucial new reasons as to why it's true and why it's important. I would hope then that my whip would say, here was the extension, here are the crucial ideas within the extension. Very briefly, you do not want to repeat your member. You just want to make sure the judge knows it. And oftentimes, if the member delivered it in a somewhat convoluted way, you want to simplify it so the judge can understand it. But more importantly, you need to explain the impacts. And that's what crystallization really is. It is, look, my member said a lot of words. Some of them were quite good. Here's why they matter. Here is the impact that we're reaching. Here's why you care about it. And that's specifically what your job is as a whip, is to start talking about the extension and explaining to the judge what it's actually proving and what it actually means. And the last thing to note, especially if you're going to do a vertical extension where you're trying to reach the same impact as your opening, saying similar things, is within crystallizing, you have to differentiate your extension. You have to be like, our opening government may have said something like this. We have something more reasonable. Or maybe they tried to prove this, but they didn't give you A, B, and C reason. We gave you A, B, and C reason. Those are all the specific kind of technical work it's your job to do in WIP, especially if your member didn't do them beforehand. The third part of whipping the extension is rebuilding or defending the extension, because obviously some people will refute it, they will POI it, they will try to take it down, and you have to put it back up and explain why it's still true. The most important thing to do here is knowing what was missed. And that means knowing what you have to prove for your extension to be valid, and then listening to your member very carefully, literally flowing their speech. And then, if you think that they've missed something, they haven't proven a crucial thing that they had to prove, your job in WIP is also to shore that up and to defend it. How you can do this is kind of strange, because oftentimes, as WIP, you can't really bring new material to the debate. What you can do is you can fill those burdens in other ways. For example, through rebuttal. So you can say, oh, the general OO problem is this. Great, I'm going to give you 4 reasons of rebuttal as to why they're incorrect. I'm going to prove this thing. And guess what? By proving that thing, I have also filled the burden in my member's case because they needed to prove this thing as well. So there are many ways around the rule of not being able to construct in WIP that you still need to use when you're damaged by another team. And oftentimes this means framing whatever defense you give as rebuttal or as responses, saying things like, oh, CO challenges us by saying this. Let's respond to that argument. Here's 4 reasons why our burden is still met, or here's 4 reasons why my member's extension is still correct. All right, you were all set. Anyway,
Can I get Balaji to
please mute. Thank you. Okay. You're unmuted.
Sorry, wait, let me deal with that.
Okay. Anyway. Yeah, so that's what rebuilding looks like. And a really useful tip here that I use as a whip often. When my member is speaking and giving the extension, I will have 2 or 3 blank sheets of paper, however many extensions we're running. And I'll just say, here's the extension. At the top, I'll do a bit crystallizing, and then it's blank. It's blank until the bottom of the page where I put, here's how I'm going to weigh the argument. And that blank space is specifically when the opposition team tries to refute me. Because in that space, I'm going to say, here's their pushback, and I give myself space to engage with it in the most important way, because that's your most important job. At the end of your speech, your goal is for the judge to have no doubt in their mind that your extension is true and that your extension is valuable. And those are the things that you're going to want to spend the most time about. All right, finally, weighing the extension. This is the most nebulous part that's kind of hard to really understand. But what I mean by this is essentially, you need to weigh both your impacts independently and explicitly against other arguments. So obviously, the baseline weighing thing still matters. Oh, this is a marginalized group, so we should care about them. Oh, this is a really intense harm, so we should care about it. Oh, this is an irreversible harm, we should care about it. All these weighing things are really important, and oftentimes your member won't get to them, so your job in WIP is to get to them. But the other thing you have to do is you have to weigh the extension against the other contributions in the round. You should say, OG's main argument is this. We in CG gave you this. Here's why you care about my argument more than OG's argument. Those are the kinds of things, and we'll talk more specifically about weighing a little later, but those are the kinds of things you have to do in WIP that matter. Great, so that's what whipping the extension looks like. Let's see, what else I have? Yep, I'm going to now start talking about how you structure your whips, because I think there's generally 2 ways that you can go about doing it, and both of them have their benefits and drawbacks. The general ways I've heard it explained are there are team by team whips where I basically say, let's go through the houses in order. Here's OG, here's OO, here's CO, here's how we beat all of them. And then there's theme by theme or clashes within whips, which is there's 3 issues in this debate. Here's how we win each one. Both of these are valid structures. I will say that if you're starting out in whip, especially in BP in college, I think it's easiest to start by team, because there's a very clear job you have to do, and it's easy to put yourself within that job and therefore not overthink things. Clashes, if you're a little more experienced, give you a lot more freedom, but they also tend to be a lot more complicated. So I'll go through them both in order. First, team by team. Very, very simple. You're just going to say, here's why my opening team loses, here's why my diagonal team loses, here's why my closing half team loses, here's why I win. The one important thing to note is your job is to order your whip team by team. So knowing which team is the biggest threat and which team you have to take out within a team by team whip. So there are 2 scenarios that you can enter. The first one, your extension is proven and really strong and it's really winning. In those cases, which is the dream scenario for a whip, your job is just slam dunking, right? Your job is just saying, position your extension as a response against other teams. Explain why your extension beats each team specifically. This is the difference between a 3v3 and a BP whip. In 3v3, you're just, oh, here's my argument, here's why it's really good. In BP, it's a slightly different job. Here's my argument, here's why it's better than that team, here's why it's better than that team, here's why it's better than that team. That's your job in BP. The second scenario, which is often going to happen, is your extension is weak for some reason because, I don't know, there wasn't much to prove or there wasn't much time. In this case, your job is to diversify risk, which means beating a team specifically and making sure you don't take the 4 in the round, but also giving other responses or doing other work within the round so that there's something for the judge to credit, which is oftentimes how teams get a 1 in really difficult rooms where it's difficult to do so. This means that you may spend less time on the extension, basically just saying something like, oh, here's the extension, here's why it's new and important. And then the rest of your speech is, look, here are 3 problems in OO's case. I'm going to point them out and explain them to you. Here's why OO can't win. Here are 3 problems in CO's case, and then doing responses to CO. And those responses are things that judges will credit to your team. So as a whip, that's another way you can win the round, by flipping arguments, by taking down arguments, by doing a lot of damage to other teams and making it work. The important thing to note here is that quality is more important than quantity. If there's a killer response or a missing burden against the team that you point out, move on once you respond sufficiently. If there's a team that's doing quite badly in the round, do not over respond to them because that's a really easy trap to fall into. But doing a bunch of damage to the team that's already to the 4 isn't going to help you. It's just going to waste time. So let's talk about each specific team and how you want to engage with them. Taking out your top half. The difficult thing about BP is you're not allowed to refute your own bench. So even if OG has some problems, I cannot just get up and say, well, most people, like some people do this. I just think you shouldn't. And like the rules technically say you shouldn't. You cannot say, oh, OG is wrong. Here's 4 reasons their arguments don't work. You cannot respond normally like that. What you can do is you can weigh against them and you can point out that they've missed burdens or they've missed impacts or they've done something that isn't good for the debate. So I can make strategic observations about their case, but I cannot refute their case directly. The way you take out your top half varies a lot depending on whether you chose to do a vertical or a horizontal extension. Remember, that's either you made an extension that was similar to their case and you're trying to prove it over them, or you made a different argument. If you chose to vertical, then your job is a lot more on, yeah. If you chose to vertical, you're unmuted. Okay. If you chose to vertical, your job is basically differentiating your case from the opening. So as whip, you're going to spend a lot of time saying, they told you ABC, we told you DEF. Here's why these are more important. Here's why these are more like meaningful. And the easiest way to do that is making arguments like, look, they tried to get to their impact, but they're losing to OO. They haven't proven their impact like fully. We give you the analysis needed to make that link. So you can take all of their impacts. We're the only team that actually proves them. That's like the clearest way to like explain why you're more important than your opening half, for example. However, if you chose to do a horizontal, then your job is actually somewhat easier because now you're just basically weighing against their argument in general. So you can say, sure, maybe OG proves this. Maybe OG proves, for example, that you hurt like certain people on the ground or you hurt certain people in a certain job, but we prove an impact that's much more wide to people in general. And so you should care about that impact more than you should care about OG's impact. That's the kind of weighing you want to make when you're horizontal. And basically at the end of the day, you just want to convince the judge that if government bench is winning, it's because of you and not because of your opening. Do as like, there's a ton of different strategies you can take to go about that. That's once again, a whole lecture in and of itself. But here, I think that's just like the general, like important thing to talk about. Yeah. Taking out your diagonal then. So what I mean by that, if you're a closing government, taking out the opening opposition or the earlier team. This can be a bit tricky. There's a tendency for whips to just over respond to everything. And like, I do this quite a lot. This is like probably my like weakest point at whip is when I'm in CO, I will, after OG has spoken, look at my sheet and I'll actually have a ton of really good responses and I'll have a whole page, but I can't really afford to spend a whole page on OG, especially because my own opening team is probably going to refute them as well. And I don't want to overlap with them. This means that you have to be really, really critical about knowing what to refute and not spending too much time while still beating their case. And the important thing to note here, the nuance, you have to figure out what's most dangerous to you. Your job is not to take out all of their content. Your job is to take out the specific content that clashes with your own case, that gets in your own way, things that preempt your premise, things that are characterization that's different than what your member has given. For example, impacts that run counter to what your own extension is. So knowing what's most important to take out and then focusing only on those things is the key job to do when you're taking out your diagonal. Finally, then taking out the back half. So if I'm CG, how am I responding to CO? This is a lot more like normal debate, like 3v3. You're just refuting, you're weighing, doing all the normal things. The one important thing to do here is efficiency. A lot of times your CO will make the similar argument to your OO. Like maybe they're derivative, which means they run the same thing. Maybe they're not, but they will make similar arguments that you can respond to as a whole. Don't waste your time repeating responses. It is okay to simply say, look, guys, CO's case is very similar to OO's. It's generally this. I'm going to respond to this case in general, apply it to both opposition teams. That's the smart way to go about refuting in whip because it allows you to save your time and cover both teams at once. And then the most important thing is to weigh. It's like, even if you have good responses, sometimes judges just don't buy them and don't agree with them. The more important thing to do is just weigh your contributions generally and just say, even if they prove the best case of their argument, here's why we still beat them. That is, I think, especially now in BP, a very important and very powerful thing to do, to take their best case and still weigh over it and beat it, because then the judge has no excuse but to vote for you, because even if they fully believe the opposition argument, you're still better than them. And generally, what do you want to do in team-by-team whips? You want to summarize their contributions. This is where it's a little different than 3v3. In 3v3, you're just refuting everything. In BP, you're refuting the one or two most important things. So you pick the most strongest or most directly clashing stuff and say, this is the main thrust of OG. Here's how we're going to interact with it. If the case seems weak to you, first point out why it's weak and destroy it with responses, but then weigh against a stronger version of that case because you never know how the judge sees it. And so the most important thing a whip can do is just cover their bases in those instances. Okay, great. That's generally team by team. The order is pretty much just, hey, I'm first going to explain and whip the extension for like a minute and a half. And then here's the other three houses in the debate and why we beat each of them. And the important thing to note here is within those clashes, you have to weigh against those teams. Great. Let's talk now about theme by theme or clashes in whips. Oftentimes, this is ideal. In most rounds, you may find yourself repeating a lot of responses or mechs in a team by team structure because teams are running vertical extensions, the motion is quite narrow, whatever. If you are more experienced, going clash by clash allows you more freedom in your whip speech. How do you structure a theme by theme whip? The first thing to note is what is your metric? What is the clash you are winning most importantly? Why is your metric the way the debate should be judged? So explaining, judge, you are going to vote on this one thing because that's the thing that's most important for XYZ reason. Here's why we prove this one thing. So the job then is explaining why you're winning under your own metric and then explaining why that clash is more important than other clashes in the round. And that's something that you'll just learn with experience as you go through it. So what do I mean by winning within the clash? Obviously, you prioritize what you're winning with, like the argument that you have that's most strong on your team. And then you're going to do a few things. First, you're going to engage claims from the opposing bench within the clash, and you use your members' contribution to beat those claims. So you will say, all right, on the clash of the economy, whether inflation happens or whatever it is the case, right? Maybe it's about like, oh, whether these officials act in corrupt ways. OO says this, CO says this. Our extension beats them for X, Y, and Z reasons. Then you differentiate your contribution from the top half clash. So you say, our opening half, they said some similar things, but they weren't good because OO beat them for some reason, or because they missed some burden internally for some reason. We are extending over them because we fill that burden, we prove this clash. Then you strengthen your extension in the clash. A lot of similar steps to team by team, it just happens integrated when you're talking through clashes. And then finally, you defend and rebuild your extension against challenges, and you weigh your contribution within the clash. At the end of the day, your job is simple. Your job is, here's an issue in the debate. Here's what we have told you and why it matters. Here's why it's beating other teams. That's really just all you're doing. And then once you've won your clash, and generally it's good to just focus on one thing and win that one thing, you can start talking about winning outside of the clash, basically doing work on the other paths to victory that different teams have and explaining why they don't work. So a lot of this is like basic external weighing, like why is your clash likelier? Why is it more important? It affects more people. It is a more intense harm. You can reverse it. There is certainty. All of these things that was like probably talked about in terms of weighing and things that are very similar to 3v3 also apply in BP. It's just in BP, use them specifically against each team. And in clashes, it's often easier to do that because you can just say, here's a clash that's important. Here's how I'm dealing with it. Okay. Last note on adapting to the round, because this is like where the actual difficulty is. Everyone knows what you're like, everyone can know what you're supposed to do in BP and whip. Once it actually starts happening, you get very, very confused very, very easily. And that's not like a problem at all. It's really reasonable. There's been a ton of rounds where I've just not known what to do in whip, where I've just sat there and been like, okay, I'm just going to talk for 7 minutes, I guess, because there's too many things happening, too many problems in the round. Two things I want to talk about. First one is refutation priority. There's a ton of responses you can make. Some of them are really smart. Not all of them are strategic because they take time and you just want to allocate the right amount of time to the right amount of things. So know when to use rebuttal and know when to use weigh. You want to use a mix of these two things, but you want to use them in such a way that at the end of the day, the judge will either buy your rebuttal or at the end, they will just buy your weighing to begin with. So a useful thing to do in refutation is bundling op arguments or bundling op reasons. So if op says 3 or 4 different things, you can simply say, look, all of these things exist, but the main idea is like this specific thrust that they're making. I'm going to respond to that. Efficiency is the name of the game. And oftentimes it means doing things like, look, they've said 6 or 7 things. That's all really one reason. Here's the logic. I'll refute that reason specifically. It means hitting the premise of their argument and saying, look, maybe they have proven 6 or 7 impacts that come from inflation, but the premise is still just inflation occurring. The premise is still like some group of people being upset. And we'll talk about that specifically. You want to be as efficient with your time as possible. The second thing to note is that oftentimes your OG or your opening half will already make good rebuttal. That's okay. Like maybe they're good at debate. It's okay. There's no reason for you to waste your time continually following up on them or continually saying what they said. So if OG makes a good response, you can utilize it. You can't do this for the entirety of your case because you still need responses, but you can say, look, this is the OO claim. OG has already dealt with this in their way. Here's an additional response. Let's move on. They're out of the debate, right? Like there is no glory in beating every single team yourself if they're already losing. What you can do as a whip is simply point out they're already losing in this debate. That's why our extension beats them as well. Right? Like these are things that you can do. And then finally, using rebuttal as a contribution. This is very important, especially when you're whipping and your partner has maybe not done the greatest job of proving the extension. You can, for example, flip arguments and say, look, this was an OO claim. We're going to flip it and explain why it hurts their case. So that's a contribution you can vote closely to us. But the more important way to do this is by making crucial responses or breaking deadlocks. This is something a lot of whips don't do, and I'm not really sure why. What I mean by this is, look, OG are like top at I'm CG and OG has made an argument and OO has made a really good response to it. I as whip from CG can just say, look, OG is losing to OO because they made a really good argument and OG couldn't respond to it. Here are the responses OG should have given. That's a crucial response they needed to make to win this round. So if you believe OG's argument at all, you give this round to us instead because we provide the responses they needed to make their case work in the first place. So this is like a really important thing you can do as whip and you probably should do. All right, last thing, practical advice on following the round. How do you just keep up with all the content? I'm just going to walk you through how I tend to flow whips. I use a lot of paper. There's a lot of different strategies you can use. There's a lot of good workshops out there on how you should flow whip or how you should deal with this. What I do is simple. During prep, my partner and I, we talk through the extension, like what we think could happen in the first place. And I have some material just lying around handy in case I need to use it. I have a different sheet for each house when I speak team by team. So I'll say, here's the OG sheet, here's the OO sheet, here's the CO sheet. And then I will have specific pages dedicated to flowing the debate. So I'll have a page that I folded that says, oh, this is the OG flow. And then I'll write down what they've said. I'll write down some responses I could use. And then from that flow, I will write my specific analysis of OG on a separate sheet. So that when I'm whipping, I have that flow paper that I haven't really used, but I've used it to write a good level of responses or a good level of observations about OG, and I'll whip from that. The last thing to note on following the round that I think is very important, feel free to rely on your partner. Like you can just say to your partner, hey, if something really important comes out of like OG in the last minute, like please tell me. Or, oh, hey, if CO says something really important and I'm gov whip and I'm writing my speech, just text me it and tell me how to respond to it. Like these are things that you need to do, and you can oftentimes rely on your partner to help you do them. The last thing then, the last thing, sometimes your member just didn't have an extension. This is a case that happens all the time, and it means that it's really hard for you as a whip to feel like you can do anything meaningful. The important thing to note is that you just need to not panic. There's always something to do. There's always a response to give. There's always a way to explain the way your partner said in a way that makes sense. All you need to do is keep your composure and find that thing. Focus on what they did prove and explain why what they did prove, even if it's not the full extension, still has meanings. Make your stance be your responses and just say, look, even if our case is not the most stellar or the most amazing, it is still a contribution. And then just spend your time taking out the other teams and explain. Even though our case is not the biggest and that's the greatest, it is still a contribution that other teams can't match in the round. So that's my general take on whipping when you don't know the extension. All right, that's about all that I had. I think this is probably a good time. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute or text them or whatever.
Hi. So first of all, I thank you, Rahul. You did a really great presentation and all. Now we actually have an upcoming debate by the end of this week. So it's 3v3. And I was just gonna ask now, usually when we go, and now I usually take the position of the whip speaker. And now our usual strategy is like, okay, what we've been taught was that, okay, everyone else, like my other two teammates, they would have their arguments like written down, and they would have a structured thing. So I usually go with a blank piece of paper. That's where I go. Um, I structure my arguments as I go. And when I talk to my friends who are also other debaters, they usually have some sort of format that they follow, which they follow for their whip speaking, where they organize their. It's different from like speaker to speaker, and I was wondering if you had a very specific one, or do you like cater it to the debate itself? Do you change it, or do you have like one set sort of a framework which other debaters could also follow and adapt, and which we could just change it up with the requirements of the debate? That would be really great.
Yeah. So in 3v3, I generally tend to be a speaker who is more like adaptive. Like I just sit there and I'm like, okay, here's what I need to do. But when I first started speaking, there was definitely a set format that I used. And that format is basically there's one thing usually that you want to win the round on, like your path to victory or whatever you want to call it. So what I think is a smart thing to do is start your whip by saying, okay, I'm going to talk about 3 clashes within the debate, or 3 like areas of like importance, like 3 sections, if you will. And then, or however many sections there are, like I feel like 3 is normally a pretty good number that like I like to organize things into. But then all you do is you simply say, okay, here's the most important thing. Here's what they said on this matter. Here's what my team said. And then just do all the work I talked about in terms of sorting through the clash, and just spend your time there first. And what you want to do before you move on is you want to explain to the judge why they should feel comfortable voting for your team on that specific clash. So in terms of like format, like how this actually works, I think like a good idea is just have like different sections on your paper for each clash. As the debate goes, fill that paper by being like, here's what they said, here's what they said. Make sure to count what your own team has responded to, because there's no need to repeat what your second speaker said, for example. So as a whip, maybe I'll just say, hey, their argument was this. My second speaker already dealt with a good amount of this argument by saying XYZ. Here's an extra response on this, right? And then once you've done that, then as whip, your job is just, here's our argument, here's why it's still standing, here's why you care about it a lot. I think keeping it simple is really quite important. Like there is no need to have like a really convoluted format that's like hard to follow all the time, or like fitting things into boxes. It's just, what are 2 or 3 issues that are really important in this debate? And then just talk about those 2 or 3 issues.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Rahul.
Yep. Yeah, if anyone else has any questions, we could go for that. Or John, I don't know how much time that you have left for this.
Yeah, I think we could honestly like table the session now. Does anyone else have any major questions that they want answered?
There's a
I think advice to a point breaker is just generally everything covered in the workshop so far because point breaker is like a 3v3 role. So unless there's something like a bit more specific, um, I think we could wrap the session up now because so
Alright.
for people asking in chat, point breaker is just like another term for like 3v3 in school. All right. Okay. That being said, thank you so much, Rahul, from the Debaters Council. I think the session was great. Oh, any good resources videos? I think that's probably a useful question. So let's
Oh
get that.
yeah, hang on. There is one actually. The video that I watched when I started learning how to whip was a video made by, yeah, let me actually just look at it. A video made by Toby Leong. Um, it's a it's a whip workshop. It is BP oriented, so that's just like that's how it is. But I can just drop the link here just to make it sense. Hopefully you can, I don't know. Hopefully that's accessible. If not, like I'm sure John can figure out a way to get that to you. But that's like a really, really good starting point. It's very, very clear. It's probably somewhat similar to this lecture. Like a lot of his takes are similar, but that and then yeah, John will has like, some other good.
Yeah. So Toby Leung was like a world champion WDC. Then I believe Matthew Anseruth, who was a Canada like 2 time schools champion, has a video on
Yeah.
whipping as well. And then I think there's a really good workshop by this guy called Connor. I forget the surname, but on rebuttal, that I think might be worth looking into. It is like a really good job for explaining like rebuttal through like this lens of debating is an exercise of proving your tower is bigger than the other team, and like rebuttal is like the offense to take the tower down. And it's like an interesting way to think about it. But yeah, that being said, thank you so much, Rahul.
Yeah.
The session was great. Thank you everyone for coming, and yeah, we'll see everyone again in the next installment. Have a good night.